In the 1930s, the Great Depression pushed countless families to the brink, forcing them to get creative about putting food on the table. Many turned to heirloom gardening methods passed down from their parents and grandparents, discovering or rediscovering hardy, easy-to-grow vegetables that could thrive in poor soil and unpredictable weather. These vegetables often fell out of favor in modern times, overshadowed by supermarket varieties. But back then, they were genuine lifesavers. They stored well, provided crucial nutrients, and offered surprising flavors when every last crumb mattered. Here, we'll take a closer look at 25 of these forgotten veggies, spotlighting the wisdom of that generation and the lessons these plants still hold for us today. Number 1. Lamb's quarters. During the Great Depression, plenty of families turned to this humble wild green when more conventional crops failed. It popped up in neglected corners of backyards, along fence lines, and in any patch of disturbed soil, often mistaken for a weed. Yet Grandma knew its worth because lamb's quarters, sometimes called wild spinach, offered vitamin A, vitamin C, and vital minerals in abundance. People boiled it, fried it in bacon grease, or ate it raw in salads when there was no money for lettuce at the store. It grew in hot, dry conditions that left other greens struggling, so it stayed available well into the summer. The leaves had a mild flavor that blended easily with beans, potatoes, or any meager protein on hand. Families also saved seeds for future plantings, using old Victory Garden know-how to keep this heirloom vegetable going season after season. While lamb's quarters provided a nutritious boost to empty dinner plates, other vegetables added the bulk and hardiness needed to carry people through hard times. Number 2. Kentucky Wonder Pole beans. Known for climbing fence posts and makeshift trellises across America, these beans kept showing up in 1930s gardens thanks to their reliable yield. They produced long, tender pods that could be eaten fresh or left to dry and stored for winter meals. Rich in protein and fiber, Kentucky Wonder Pole beans were perfect for stretching the small amounts of meat people could afford, or for serving as a substitute when meat was impossible to come by. Many folks made hearty bean soups or stewed the pods with salt pork, letting the pots simmer on the wood stove all day. Families saved every seed they could, practicing seed-saving techniques passed down from older generations who remembered how critical it was to replant rather than buy seed. This bean was also valued because it kept on producing as long as you kept picking. And when you needed something beyond beans to stick to your ribs, there were other root vegetables that dug in deep, literally and figuratively. Number 3. Turnips. These hardy bulbs were a lifesaver during the Depression, primarily because they could tolerate cool temperatures and be harvested long after many other crops had given up. People valued both the bulb and the leafy tops, which were boiled or sautéed for extra vitamins. Turnips also stored exceptionally well in root cellars, sand boxes, or even in a cool corner of the shed, meaning families could count on them through harsh winters. Mashed turnips often replaced potatoes when money was tight, and they gained a reputation for helping people feel full on minimal resources. Some folks pickled them to make sure they stayed edible for months. If one type of turnip was grown out, families had a few other dependable greens to keep them going until spring. Number 4. Collard greens. These broad-leafed greens became an iconic staple of Depression-era gardening, especially in the South. Collards thrived in poor soil and could withstand frost that would wipe out more delicate vegetables. When simmered all day with salted pork or bacon grease, they released a savory pot liquor that was sipped straight from the bowl for its nutrients. The leaves were tough, sure, but that made them resistant to wilting in the summer heat or freezing in winter. Collard patches became little gold mines in the backyard, delivering iron, calcium, and vitamins that kept families going when grocery shelves were empty. People shared seeds with neighbors, preserving a slice of nostalgia that carries through even modern gardening tips. For a hardier vegetable that stored almost forever, another old favorite stepped into the spotlight. Number 5. Danish ballhead cabbage. Round, dense, and seemingly indestructible, this cabbage variety was prized for its long storage life. It could remain fresh for months in a cool cellar, wrapped in newspaper or stored in straw, letting families enjoy a reliable source of vitamin C deep into winter. It was the foundation of many simple meals, from cabbage stews to skillet-fried side dishes mixed with onions and potatoes. Fermenting was also common, turning entire batches of Danish ballhead into sauerkraut that stretched well into the coldest months. Families often grew these heirloom vegetables in their victory gardens or their version of a retro garden, knowing they could rely on cabbage long after other greens had turned yellow. While cabbages were great for storing, people also needed fresh flavors that broke the monotony of repeated meals, and they found that in a prickly but rewarding plant. Number 6. Cardoon. Related to artichokes, this spiky plant looked intimidating at first glance, but it was a hidden gem for those who knew how to prepare it. Cardoon thrived in warm, dry conditions and kept growing when more fragile plants withered away. Once the tough outer fibers were peeled, the stalks were boiled or braised into a nutty artichoke-like treat that was higher in fiber and vitamin C than many other vegetables around. Families sometimes sliced and fried it in bacon fat if they had it, or tossed it into stews to stretch small bits of meat. Because cardoon was overlooked by many, it often went undisturbed in gardens. Meanwhile, if the weather turned unbearably hot, that meant you needed greens that actually welcomed high temperatures. Number 7. Malabar spinach. Regular spinach would bolt and turn bitter under a scorching sun, but Malabar spinach thrived in sweltering heat. Climbing like a vine, it latched onto fences, poles, or any surface that would support it. Families liked picking its thick, glossy leaves daily, adding them raw to salads, or tossing them into soups for a nutritional kick of iron, calcium, and vitamin A. The mildly slimy texture helped thicken Depression-era stews, making limited ingredients seem more substantial. Thanks to its continuous growth, people could harvest it all season, a valuable trick in those dust-blown summers when the ground felt like concrete. Still, not all gardens were in landlocked areas. Some folks along the coast needed a vegetable that could handle salty breezes. Number 8. Sea kale. This sturdy perennial handled poor, sandy soils that defeated less resilient crops. It offered thick, bluish leaves that resembled collards, which were rich in vitamin C and fiber. In early spring, the young shoots were blanched or covered to keep them tender and tasted like mild asparagus. As the season wore on, families sautéed the leaves the same way they'd cook kale or collards, soaking up nutrients critical to warding off illness. People sometimes pickled or canned sea kale to ensure it lasted long after the first frosts. While sea kale grew best by the coast, inland families could still rely on root vegetables that produced generous harvests even when neglected. Number 9. Jerusalem artichokes. These knobby tubers, also called sunchokes, belong to the sunflower family and grew well in poor, rocky soil. They multiplied underground with minimal care, so folks could simply dig them up when needed. The subtle, nutty sweetness made them a great addition to soups or roasts, and sometimes they were even mashed like potatoes. People appreciated that they could leave them in the ground all winter, digging out only what they planned to use, which acted like natural refrigeration. They provided a steady source of carbohydrates and could be dried or ground into flour to stretch recipes further. But for an even sweeter root that helped replace precious sugar, families sometimes grew a nearly forgotten favorite. Number 10. Skirret. This old-world perennial had long, skinny roots that boasted a natural sweetness, which was especially appreciated when refined sugar was too expensive. Many folks had never heard of skirret by the 1930s, but those who inherited seeds from parents or grandparents happily reaped its benefits. They boiled or roasted the roots to bring out the sweet flavor, sometimes mashing them into soups or stews to add a richer taste. Skirret often grew in cooler climates without too much fuss, producing multiple roots around each plant. Families learned to treasure it for desserts or for sweetening side dishes, and they sometimes saved the seeds to ensure next year's crop. Of course, sweet flavors weren't the only thing people foraged when times were desperate. Even so-called weeds became valuable resources. Number 11. Dandelion. Popping up in yards, vacant lots, and sidewalk cracks, dandelions were free for the taking. Their green leaves were often bitter, but with proper boiling or frying, they turned into an excellent substitute for spinach. They were high in vitamins and minerals, giving bodies much-needed nutrients. Grandparents sometimes roasted dandelion roots to brew a coffee-like beverage when actual coffee was too costly. The bright flowers also made fritters or simple syrup, and people used them to create homemade dandelion wine for a bit of cheer in an otherwise grim era. Because they grew without planting or watering, dandelions were a godsend for struggling households. Yet for families who wanted a dependable leafy green, they could cultivate all season. Another option took center stage. Number 12. Swiss chard. Standing tall in both heat and moderate cold, Swiss chard was a go-to green for many 1930s gardeners. It outlasted spinach and lettuce, which tended to wilt or bolt in the summer. People cut the leaves over and over, letting them regrow and provide a continuous harvest. High in vitamins A and K, Swiss chard could be added to soups, sautéed with onions, or mixed with beans to stretch a meal. When groceries were limited, its bright stems and dark leaves provided a welcome splash of color and nutrients. Cooks sometimes chopped the stalks to mimic celery in recipes, maximizing every part of the plant. Along with fresh greens, though, people needed vegetables that could last for months without spoiling. Number 13, storage onions. Onions weren't just a flavor enhancer, they were a lifeline. Properly cured and stored in a cool, dark place, they would last through the winter, adding depth to thin broths and bean dishes. Onions made humble meals more palatable, whether in the form of onion gravy or caramelized slices on homemade bread. Because onion seeds were relatively easy to save from season to season, families often grew them in abundance. They were part of many nostalgic memories of Great Depression cooking, when the aroma of onions frying in lard meant something hearty was on the way, even if the meal was just bread and onion sandwiches. For another hearty root that kept well, folks sometimes turned to a lesser-known tuber. Number 14, Chinese artichokes. Also called crow's nez, these small, spiral-shaped tubers thrived where other vegetables failed. They didn't need fancy fertilizer or prime soil, and they came back year after year. Families harvested them as needed, boiling or sautéing to bring out their slightly nutty flavor. Pickling was another popular option, since pickled Chinese artichokes lasted for months without requiring refrigeration. People realized they weren't as starchy as potatoes, but they added texture and interest to meals that might otherwise seem bland. By rotating them with beans and other legumes, gardeners practiced a form of crop diversification that helped soil health, an important lesson from traditional farming. Another starchy root gave an even more robust flavor and plenty of calories for days of fieldwork. Number 15, rutabaga. A cross between a turnip and a cabbage, rutabagas were dense, nutrient-packed, and perfect for cold climates. Many families used rutabagas like potatoes, mashing them or roasting them with a bit of salt to draw out their earthy sweetness. They were known to store exceptionally well in root cellars, meaning folks could rely on them throughout the winter when fresh produce was scarce. Rutabagas were also made into a flour substitute by grinding them down, helping stretch limited wheat supplies. Even though they weren't the most glamorous vegetable, they played a starring role in Depression-era gardening, bridging the gap between survival and nourishment. When people craved a bit of sweetness in the midst of all the root vegetables, they turned to a tiny fruit often overlooked in modern times. Number 16, ground cherries. Tucked inside papery husks, these little golden berries brought a burst of natural sweetness to the dinner table. They sprang up like weeds in some regions, thriving in both full sun and partial shade, which made them easy to grow in those dusty 1930s conditions. Grandma might turn them into jam or pie filling when she managed to scrounge up enough sugar or honey. If sugar was scarce, she'd still use ground cherries to add a fruity flavor to otherwise plain bread puddings or to sweeten up a pot of oatmeal. Because they stored relatively well in their husks, they were a treat even after the first frosts hit. Sweets were nice, but protein was crucial, and one particular bean stood out as a staple of Great Depression survival. Number 17, navy beans. Known for their role in baked beans and bean soup, navy beans were a top choice for families who needed long-lasting, filling food. Dried beans could sit on a pantry shelf almost indefinitely if kept free from moisture. High in protein and fiber, they replaced meat in many meals, and a pot of beans simmering all day on the stove was a common sight. Families often added onions, a ham bone if they had it, or a sprinkle of salt to create a modest but hearty supper. Navy beans also made appearances in bread or casseroles, stretching every crumb and scrap into something that could feed an entire group. Of course, coffee was another commodity that went missing during those years, so people improvised with a plant that grew almost anywhere. Number 18, chicory root. When the budget wouldn't allow even a single scoop of coffee, people turned to roasted chicory root for a similar bitterness and comfort. Chicory grew well in poor soils and required little care, making it a prime candidate for foraging along roadsides or in abandoned lots. After digging up the roots, families washed them, chopped them into small pieces, and roasted them until they were dry and brittle. Ground into a fine powder, chicory made a dark brew that stood in for coffee, sometimes blended with a small amount of real coffee when available. It became a nostalgic memory for many who still prefer the flavor today. While the search for coffee substitutes was important, finding fresh vegetables deep into winter mattered even more, and a certain frosty-friendly root met that need. Number 19. Parsnips. Parsnips actually improved in flavor after the first frost, turning sweeter and more appealing than they might be otherwise. People would leave them in the ground long after other crops were harvested, digging them up in the dead of winter for soups, stews, or a roasted side dish. This practice saved precious storage space elsewhere, and parsnips offered vitamin C and potassium to ward off nutrition deficits. Sliced thin and fried, they offered a crispy snack reminiscent of potato chips, a small luxury in an era without many treats. Parsnips, like so many heritage vegetables, became a staple in the 1930s, reminding folks of the times when you had to be patient to get the best flavor. Another crop, however, was all about long-term storage and versatility for baking, boiling, and more. Number 20. Field corn. Sweet corn might have tasted better straight off the cob, but field corn was the real survival crop. Once it was dried, people ground it into cornmeal for bread, tortillas, grits, and mush. Because wheat flour was expensive or sometimes non-existent, cornmeal filled the gap. Families also fed it to chickens and pigs, ensuring that even livestock had something to eat during lean months. Field corn contributed to the iconic image of 1930s Americana, with dusty farmland and a patch of tall corn stalks next to a rundown barn. It was central to the concept of victory gardens and grow your own, because it covered multiple needs: human food, animal feed, and even bedding from leftover husks. But for those looking for a multi-purpose plant that offered both edible roots and usable greens, there was another choice. Number 21. Hamburg-rooted parsley. Common parsley might be used mainly as a garnish today, but Hamburg-rooted parsley was grown for both its leafy tops and its thick, carrot-like root. The root had a delicate, nutty flavor that bulked up soups and stews, especially when there wasn't enough meat on hand. Parsley greens added vitamins and bright flavor to plain dishes, while the root provided a starchy component that filled bellies on cold evenings. Because it grew reasonably well in less fertile soil, families didn't need fancy fertilizers, just decent ground and occasional watering. Seed saving from this variety ensured that once a family had it, they could keep it going indefinitely. For a crop that delivered a dense calorie punch, though, some people relied on a tiny tuber with a misleading name. Number 22. Chufa tiger nuts. Not actually nuts at all. These little tubers grew in poor, sandy soil and produced a sweet, milky flavor when chewed. People sometimes ground them into flour to create porridge or a kind of pudding-like dish. Others extracted the liquid to make a makeshift milk, especially valuable when dairy was out of reach. Because chufa was high in fiber and minerals, it offered a surprising nutritional boost. It also reseeded itself, popping back up year after year once established, so families who planted it could count on a recurring harvest. They were often overlooked by thieves or by those who didn't recognize the plant, making it a quiet but reliable staple in desperate times. But when you needed something massive to feed both people and animals, you went for a giant root that rivaled footballs in size. Number 23. Mangoldwurzel. Originally grown for livestock, mangoldwurzel soon became known as a human food source too. Its ability to thrive in poor soil and reach enormous sizes made it irresistible to families needing to stretch every meal. Boiled or mashed like potatoes, it brought a mild, earthy sweetness. People also fermented it, turning it into a tangy side dish that lasted for months. The leaves resembled Swiss chard and could be sautéed for greens, maximizing every part of the plant. Mangoldwurzel was a true representation of old-style heritage vegetables and retro gardening methods, sometimes referenced in nostalgic stories about how nothing went to waste. While it took a bit of effort to harvest and prepare, nobody argued with the sheer volume of food it provided. Another vegetable offered a different sort of comfort, reminding folks of oysters when they couldn't afford anything from the sea. Number 24. Salsify. Nicknamed the oyster plant, salsify developed a subtle seafood flavor after cooking. Families sautéed it in butter, if they had any, or boiled it with onions to bring out a rich taste. Because it was hardy and frost-tolerant, salsify could be left in the ground well into winter, just like parsnips. People often dredged slices in flour and fried them to create mock oyster fritters, an imaginative twist during a time when fresh seafood was far beyond most budgets. The plant's seeds were sometimes traded among neighbors, eager to try something new that could break the monotony of root vegetables. Salsify proved that even in the darkest years of the 1930s, a bit of culinary creativity could go a long way. Speaking of creativity, one lesser-known perennial green was a real gift because it came back year after year with minimal fuss. Number 25, Good King Henry. Considered a wild or weed in some places, Good King Henry was anything but useless to Depression-era families. It produced tender shoots in spring that people cooked like asparagus, while the mature leaves were boiled or fried like spinach. This meant a steady supply of vitamins and minerals for many months, a lifesaver when store-bought produce was scarce or too expensive. It thrived in less than ideal soil, requiring barely any maintenance to return every season. This old-fashioned plant was shared through cuttings or seeds passed down by word of mouth, a piece of traditional farming that lingered in rural areas. Good King Henry rounded out a garden that might also include field peas, since those peas were another legume that provided protein and stayed good when dried. By blending greens like Good King Henry with hardy beans, root vegetables, and other heritage foods, families managed to survive and even find small moments of joy in an otherwise challenging time.